Good morning, good evening, or like in our case, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to the penultimate episode of Global Crisis, Global Solidarity, a bi-weekly discussion show hosted by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung and streaming live from our headquarters in Berlin. Since the beginning of the corona pandemic began, we've been streaming on the first and third Wednesday of every month and inviting scholars, activists, and other partners of the foundation to join us in discussion to develop a better understanding of the current economic and social crisis rocking our world, as well as ask what kinds of strategies an internationalist left in the 21st century needs to win. Today we'll be talking about what happened roughly 10 years ago today when protests in Tunisia sparked by the self-immolation of a young man named Mohamed Bouazizi in protest to ongoing harassment by police sparked what became known as the Arab Spring. Masses of people from Morocco to Bahrain and every Arab country in between took to the streets to protest for freedom, democracy, and a better life for all. In some places, it led to the fall of dictators, it led to free elections, the founding of trade unions and other new mass organizations. In other countries, specifically Syria, it brought horrific bloodshed and destruction that will take generations to heal. Now, the Arab Spring was arguably the beginning of a longer political cycle that originated in the outbreak of the world economic crisis in 2007 and 2008, saw the development of protest movements like the Movement of the Squares throughout Southern Europe, or Occupy Wall Street in New York and around the United States, and later developed into a series of other political upheavals, such as the rise of Jeremy Corbyn in the British Labour Party, or the presidential candidacies of Bernie Sanders in the United States. As 2020 grinds to an end, we've approached what arguably is the end of this cycle with the defeat of both of those left-wing insurgent candidacies in the United States and Great Britain, but also a general feeling among wide sections of the left, and especially in the Arab world, that the hope of 10 years ago has ended in disappointment. We want to look back to ask what the Arab Spring was, what it achieved, and what we could maybe continue to expect from it today. We have an excellent guest to discuss with us today. I'd like to welcome Hossam el-Hamalawy, a journalist originally from Egypt, himself a participant in the Arab Spring uprising, who is now studying or working on a doctorate about the Egyptian uprising here in Berlin. My name is Lauren Bellhorn, and joining me today, as always, is Fida Al-Zanin. If you'd like to be part of today's conversation, feel free to drop a comment or a question in the Facebook chat box, and we'll do our best to integrate as many of them as possible. So, Hossam, let's start out with your perspective. So, like I just said, you were also yourself active in the Arab Spring, specifically in Egypt, where you're born and raised, and were politically active for many years. So, I want to ask you, or start out by asking you a pretty simple question. How did you feel during those days in late 2010 and 2011? What was the atmosphere like in the country? And how does that compare to where we are now? How do people feel today, 10 years later, about the uprising?
Some people were taken by surprise, both inside Egypt and outside, when the revolution broke out. But I would argue that anyone who's been following closely what was happening in Egypt and who's been following the political and the social scene in Egypt in the years in the run-up to the uprising should not have been surprised. I recall that I wrote a blog post on the 31st of October 2010, like 3 months before the uprising, saying there's something in the air, where I was kind of like predicting that, you know, Egypt is heading towards a social explosion. And this was even before the uprising in Tunisia took place. This isn't because I have some magical powers to predict the future, nor because of like over-intelligence, but seriously, anyone who's been following how the curve of descent has been going up steadily since 2000, since the year 2000, because revolution is a process, and it just doesn't come out of the blue. It is usually preceded by precipitants and preconditions that would take years to ferment in order to reach
give us a couple examples?
Before the year 2000, no one could whisper Mubarak's name in public. No one could talk about Mubarak. Industrial militancy was below zero, no strikes. Everything was on the defeat in terms of dissent. Professional syndicates were nationalized, and Egypt was in the midst of a dirty war, Latin American style, against dissent, whereby people were disappearing, killed extrajudicially, prisons were being filled. But with the outbreak of the Palestinian Intifada, the second Palestinian Intifada in the year 2000, this was like a rock that was thrown in still water. And it started brewing some dissent in Egypt and revived street politics. Although all the mobilizations were over regional issues originally, meaning here Palestine and the anti-war movement, but the focus of dissent started to shift domestically very quickly. And that's when you had the rise of Kifaya, the Enough movement against Mubarak in 2004. It was our pro-democracy movement and the first Cairo Spring, as some observers called it. And it created political mobility in the country that also spilled over to the working class later. And that's when we started getting the mass strikes, initially in the textile sector in December 2006. And this evolved into industrial militancy everywhere. Many people, I guess your viewers who would be interested in left politics in general might be familiar with the name Khalid Saeed, who was the icon of the Egyptian revolution. He was a middle-class young man who was killed under police torture in Alexandria in 2010. And his horrific murder sparked a wide anti-torture movement that was credited with the uprising later. But I just want you to think, and I want to stress that, if the Khalid Saeed incident happened in the year 2000, it wouldn't have triggered the revolution. If it had happened in the year 2007, it would not have triggered the revolution. And actually, you know, there were bazillion cases of Khalid Saeed like in the previous years. But by 2010, 2011, Egyptians have reached a level of confidence vis-à-vis the regime and the police, and have reached a level of disillusionment vis-à-vis the regime, that an incident like this was enough to spark the uprising later. These were the most beautiful days in my life. I mean, you asked me how did it feel, you know, I mean, at the time. Especially on the 28th of January 2011, this is so-called the Friday of Anger. And that's when Egyptians took to the streets in all the cities, from Alexandria to Aswan, from Marsa Matruh to Sinai. More than 190 police stations were burnt. These are torture facilities, to be more specific. And I saw for the first time in my life the Central Security Forces, these are the police paramilitaries, running away, escaping from us. I never felt that empowered, I never felt that free, I never felt that secure in my life as those days. Now, looking back at it like 10 years later, of course the situation is very dismal. Today, the situation is even worse than Mubarak's days. But that's what happens when a counter-revolution prevails. Things do not return to what they were. They go even worse than how it started. And, you know, since we're here in Germany, we all know, you know, I mean, what did this do to Germany in the previous revolution that it faced with the rise of fascism? Today, we have more than 60,000 political prisoners in Egyptian prisons. Extrajudicial killings have been normalized by the security services. In Sinai, there is a counter-insurgency campaign which has turned into a bloody long war, whereby the Sinai residents, the civilians, are the ones who are paying the real price, not the militants nor the regime. There is no freedom of assembly. You cannot even have a protest of like 2 or 3 people, in Egypt. No independent trade unions. They've all been crushed. Most of the political parties, if not all of them, have been either co-opted or crushed. The youth revolutionary movements that we had, most of their organizers are either in prison or dead, or basically they have disintegrated out of demoralization. And what we have is a classic military dictatorship at the moment. A dictatorship that also enjoys the backing of the international powers, as we will speak maybe later in the show. So the situation is dismal, for sure. But it's not because of the revolutions. You cannot blame the revolutions for it. I would blame the counter-revolution for what happens.
And you've already mentioned that revolution is a process, and we tend to think of those revolutions as being associated with political left, trade unions, socialists, etc. So what kinds of organizations were most important in the Arab Spring? There are, of course, different organizations. And we know that the Muslim Brotherhood was very prominent or influential in the Arab Spring.
The Egyptian revolution and a number of other revolutions have been described as leaderless revolutions. But this is a little bit misleading. They were not leaderless revolutions. Spontaneity for sure did play a central role in the uprising, like any other, uprising that happens throughout history. It is usually preceded by the spontaneous self-action of the masses. But there were active organizations in the uprisings, and I would even argue that if there weren't these organizations, at least you would not have managed to get rid of Mubarak and achieve some successes in the first phase of the revolution. Among those were, for sure, the independent and unofficial networks of labor campaigners who were not necessarily members of any political parties, and they were not also members of the state-backed General Federation of Trade Unions. But these were seasoned strike leaders who have managed to gain experience across the years in organizing and in staging, the mass strikes. And if it wasn't for those strikes, by the way, that happened in the last week of the 18 days of the Egyptian uprising, we would not have gotten rid of Mubarak. There were youth movements and political parties on the left who were also very active in the uprising, and they have accumulated experience in organizing in the political scene over the previous 2 decades, if not at least the previous decade. And there were also the Islamists. They were also part of that uprising, at least in the beginning. Many people are not comfortable with that idea, especially in the left-wing circles, which regard the Islamists in a bulk as fascists. They just lump them all together in one basket, which in my view is a miscategorization, and it is bad analysis of Islamism in general. And it is the kind of analysis that made many of them later side with the military counter-revolution in the name of crushing, the Islamofascists, or siding with the ruling regimes in their war on terror.
You mean the coup in Egypt?
Not just the coup in Egypt, also in Syria. People, supported Hafez al-Assad because he's fighting, the Islamic fascists. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists in general are a very contradictory phenomenon because they are a multi-class organizations. Like you find in the Muslim Brotherhood, I'm talking here in the past tense because at the moment, they are crushed. Most of them are in jails, in prison, and we need to come up with a new categorization for what they stand for at the moment. But they had in their leadership like millionaires, like Khairat Shater, and other businessmen. But at the same time, the bulk of the organization was like middle-class activists who were like doctors, engineers, pharmacists. And they had some support among the working class and among the urban poor and the peasantry. So in these multi-class organizations, whenever they mobilize, they are always subject for fragmentations and splits, because you cannot come up with an agenda that suits the interests of all the members of that organization. And so on the one hand, its leadership during the uprising acted in a very opportunistic manner first, they did not endorse the calls for protests on January 25th. Secondly, after it became clear that the uprising is going to happen anyways, they threw their lot in the uprising, but at the same time sent delegates to negotiate with Omar Suleiman, who was our spy chief, and to negotiate with the regime a compromise. And they even thought about suspending the protests during the 18 days. But that's the leadership. On the other hand, the base cadres were part of the Tahrir occupation. They defended the Tahrir sit-in heroically during the so-called the Battle of the Camel, and many of them died defending the revolution. And on every twist and turn later in the revolution, the leadership would be taking very opportunistic positions, but the youth themselves on several occasions took very revolutionary stands. And they even disobeyed organizational orders about participating in the uprisings. Yes.
So, like moving from the revolution to the counter-revolution, there was so much hope, so much international support, and also enthusiasm. Despite all of that, the ruling class in most of the Arab states, they managed to crack down on protests. The counter-revolution. So what did this counter-revolution look like in the Arab Spring and in Egypt? And why do you think they were successful in the counter-revolution?
The counter-revolution took different forms in different Arab countries according to the seriousness of the situation and according to what stage of the insurrection and militancy that these revolutions reach. In the case of Egypt, it took them 3 years in order to regain the strength and regain the confidence and to regain the ability to wage a mass crackdown and conduct some of the worst massacres in the history of modern Egypt. Actually, it's not some, it is the worst massacres in the history of modern Egypt. We never had as many people killed on a single day as we've seen after the 2013 July coup. So with the series of massacres, they managed to kill dissent in Egypt. Initially, these massacres were cheered by sections of the Egyptian left and the liberal intelligentsia, which saw this as a war against fascism. But it was a very stupid position to take. And the military, after they finished off the Islamists, they finished off the secularists. They started cracking down on the left and the liberals, and right now, all the liberal and the left-wing forces have either been neutralized or co-opted or basically besieged by the regime. In other parts of the world, in the region, like Bahrain, they played with the sectarian card. So they managed to crush, for example, the protests by labeling them as Shia and as loyal to Iran and part of some foreign conspiracy. And they conducted series of massacres against them with the help of the rest of the GCC countries, the Arab Gulf countries. In Syria, that's probably a much more sad story, where the regime also played with the sectarian card on occasions and played with the anti-imperialist card on other occasions. And with the support of the Russians and the Iranians, managed to crush the revolution and polarize it on a sectarian line. And of course, it didn't help that the Syrian opposition, many of them sought help and refuge from foreign powers, which have, I mean, definitely used them for their own agenda in the end. In Morocco, there were like mass protests, but they were crushed, I mean, by the regime in security crackdowns. But at the same time, the king made some concessions, constitutional concessions. So this managed to absorb, you know, I mean, dissent back then. In other parts of the Arab world, for example, in Saudi Arabia, I mean, the eastern part also went through its spring, but, you know, it wasn't really covered that much internationally. And this was like met with fierce, bloody crackdowns amid lack of coverage from the international media.
And as someone who participated in the Egyptian revolution, at what point did you think that tables had turned and you were going to win, I mean the masses, but also at what point did you realize that you are losing? Were there any key moments that you said, okay, that's it?
There were several key moments, but if I want to narrow them down and highlight like the main ones, the positive ones, you know, the ones where we said that, oh my God, we're finally winning, were definitely on the 28th of January, 2011, the Friday of Anger. And the second one, which is not really discussed that much in any literature about the revolution, but on the 5th of February, in a bid to isolate Tahrir from the rest of the population, the Prime Minister Ahmed Shafiq, who was conducting the counter-revolution at the time, decided to open up the banks and to open up the businesses and to open up the country once again after it was like all closed during the uprising, so as to normalize the situation in the country, and basically us in Tahrir would be like the few lunatics who are like staging a sit-in while the rest of the country is like back to normal, business as usual. But it fired back, because as soon as the workers went back to their factories and the civil servants went back to their workplaces, they took Tahrir to the factories and to the workplaces, and we started getting the mass strikes. So on that day, you know, when I started receiving from my industrial contacts that we're going on strike, you know, when going on strike, I was like, game over. I mean, it's just a matter of time before Mubarak is thrown. As for the negative ones, like, you know, the moment where I said, oh my God, like it's over, or like game over, or we're losing, it wasn't just after the coup. I mean, unlike many, I still had some hope that we can confront the coup and we can get rid of Sisi sometime later. But it was in mid-2014, following the presidential elections between Sisi and Hamdin Sabahi, who was a Nasserist politician. After Sisi got officially inaugurated as a president, I told myself that game over, that I don't think that a revival is going to happen anytime soon. And I was right.
Speaking of game over, well, there's a couple of games that I think aren't quite over, but I wanted to go back a little bit to Syria. But I think maybe the Syrian example can also be used to understand the dynamics of revolution a bit more broadly, because, I mean, a repressive state, whether it's Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, whatever the ideological composition or facade of that state is, always rules with both carrots and sticks. So you have repression, but you also have material incentives, whether it's jobs or subsidized housing, et cetera. And it seems to me like if we look at Syria, but maybe also for a country like Saudi Arabia, the ruling class or the rulers of the state managed to drive a wedge between the population so that at least significant minorities, if not majorities, continued to support the state, right, and to support the ruler. Do you think today, is there something like a constituency for continuing the Arab Spring, or have the majority of people decided that this kind of activity brings more trouble than it's worth, especially in a place like Syria?
I mean, the situation, of course, differs from one country to the other. The Syrian situation is definitely the much more complex one, and you know, this needs, like, you know, I mean, an entire episode in itself, and probably, yeah, I mean, if not, yeah, I mean, we will need volumes, you know, yeah. I mean, to try to analyze it or to come up with a good position on it. But it's not as simple as the regime managed to win over the population, in the case of Syria at least. I mean, this might be the case in other countries, which I'll cite later. The Syrian regime at some point was about to fall. I mean, in the first year of 2011, the protests were mass protests. All sects were taking part in it, unlike the situation later. Many of the grassroots organizers were secular activists. It's not true that, you know, it was instigated by the Muslim Brotherhood suddenly. The Islamists were part of it, you know, but I mean, because they are part of society. I mean, you're not living on Mars. You know, if you're gonna organize anything in the Arab world, you'll be confronted with the question of Islamism. Yeah. So you either like side with the state in massacring them, and then you end up empowering the military dictatorship, or you try to coordinate with them on some common issues as much as possible and confront them on other issues which you think that are anti-civil liberties. But you cannot uproot them, you know, just like that. So in the case of Syria, you know, it started as a peaceful mass protests, then faced with repression, sections of the army started splitting and joining the revolutionaries, which is also a scenario that happens in any, you know, I mean, revolution, whether like the classic examples of the Bolsheviks, all the way, you know, I mean, up until like much more modern cases. I mean, look at Portugal, for example, in the 70s, and even later, you know. But the problem is, because of the lack of organizations that can provide clear politics that are anti-sectarian and that are rooted in working class politics, where you can bring the country to a standstill by a general strike, the revolution fell into the hands on both sides that were sinister hands. I mean, on the one hand, you had the regime that painted itself in like international leftist circles as like anti-imperialist. So, you know, many sections of the traditional left sided with it. But it was supported by the Russians and it was supported by the Iranians on the one hand. And I'm talking here about direct military intervention. In addition to being supported by some of the most reactionary ruling classes in the Arab world, including the Egyptian military junta and including sections of the GCC countries. And on the other hand, you had opposition, which had horrible politics. I mean, you had Islamist militias that were publicly threatening the people of Damascus, that when we enter Damascus, we're gonna like destroy all the Shia shrines, and we're gonna like, you know, crush your skulls. And that really doesn't really help your cause that much if you're trying to win over the population. Yeah. So it turned into sectarian polarization, and I cannot even simplify it as like Sunni versus Shia, because, by the way, the majority of the Syrian regime army are Sunnis in the end, you know, because they try to depict the whole thing as, you know, oh, it's, you know, the Shia who are like in power and they are fighting, you know, the majority of Sunni population. It's not really, you know, that black and white, you know, I mean, in the end. So on the one hand, the regime managed to play his cards, their cards really well. They managed to gain international support among circles of the left and among circles of the far right. I mean, it's really, it's such a unique situation where you have fascists, you know, I mean, in the US, as we've seen, you know, who are like, you know, wearing T-shirts like, you know, I mean, Assad did nothing wrong, you know, or Assad was right. And at the same time, you have like, you know, revolutionary leftists also supporting the regime as anti-imperialists. But again, I mean, on the other hand, you know, the Islamist politics were not really much better. So at this point, I mean, it's very difficult to take, like, you know, I mean, a clear position, but there are few things that you can take position against, at least. Like, you cannot be on the side of Assad on any occasion. Assad is not an anti-imperialist. You cannot be on the side of the Turks, for example, because, you know, some tried to paint the Turkish government and Erdogan as like supporters of the Syrian revolution. They are not. And they have played their cards very cynically. And they have established some pockets, you know, that are just completely loyal to them in the north. They are engaged in horrific human rights abuses against the Kurds, both in their country and in Syria with their operations. You cannot be on the side of NATO and the international powers and Israel, who are like bombing targets inside Syria, claiming that they are fighting ISIS and they are fighting Al-Qaeda and that they are fighting Iranian expansionism, blah, blah, blah. So for a leftist like myself, what I would be for is getting rid of any foreign intervention in Syria of any kind. I don't think that any kind of foreign intervention would help. I would be for organizing to receive the refugees and to fight racism against Syrian refugees anywhere they went. If there are pockets that are still not under the regime dominance, I would not be among those who would be cheering the regime's encroachment into these places. But at the same time, unfortunately, with such a complicated situation at the moment, there isn't any solution that will come from within Syria at the time. The solution would come from outside in terms of like social and political change in the region. That's when it can change the tide once again for the sake of regime change in a progressive manner in Syria.
Political and social change, that touches on something else I want to ask you about, because we really only have one example of a state where the Arab Spring seems to have won, right? And that would be Tunisia, also the first country in this sequence where there was something like a political revolution, a long-serving autocrat was overthrown, and more or less a parliamentary democracy has been established. Everywhere else, we've more or less had counter-revolution or some kind of ongoing muddling through. But still, if we look at Tunisia, okay, there's freedom of the press, there's a major growth in personal freedom, but all of the social conditions, right, that for example, the reason why Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire continue unabated, and from what I gather, there's a widespread feeling that not much has actually changed in the last 10 years. So I guess I have a two-pronged question for you. Was the Arab Spring about a political or a social revolution? Particularly, you know, how did the average person feel about it? And what is the link between the two moving forward?
The slogan that was raised in Tahrir during the 18 days, and it became the slogan of the Egyptian revolution, and actually it got coined later in other revolutions, was عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية, bread, freedom and social justice. Any revolution, for it to be successful, it cannot be limited only to the political sphere. If no change whatsoever happens in the social sphere, then the revolution got defeated. You have mentioned Tunisia, and you have mentioned it as, you know, observers tend to think that Tunisia was exception and it was like the only success. But I hate to upset them, but I do not think that Tunisia was a success, because a defeat does not necessarily have to come in the shape of massacres. I mean, thank God, you know, I mean, that there were no massacres that happened in Tunisia. I'm so happy, you know, I mean, for this. And at the same time, I cannot deny that that Tunisia today, in terms of political and civil liberties, is a little bit better than it was under Ben Ali. There is no comparison. But at the same time, the counter-revolution in Tunisia managed to co-opt the revolution. It managed to diffuse it via an alliance between the Islamists and between figures from the old regime. And it has been ruling since the revolution. I mean, this ruling alliance with like figures of the old regime and, you know, I mean, the Islamists on the one hand, you know, this has kept the country stable, but at the same time diffused the revolution from within. And the social conditions that essentially led to the uprising are still there. I mean, unemployment is still rampant, social injustices are still rampant, police brutality, I mean, still exists in Tunisia, which is, you know, very ironic because that's what triggered the revolution. So going back to your questions about the political and the social side, I mean, they are dialectically interlinked. I mean, I mean, no political success can happen without social change, and no social change can happen without also, you know, I mean, political change. They are interlinked. But many, not just in the West, but also in the Arab world, they tend to forget this whole social side. And this is for a sinister motive, in my view. The West, in addition to sections of the Egyptian and the Arab middle classes in general, tried to paint this revolution as a youth revolution, a revolution for dignity, that's conducted by the IT savvy, BlackBerry, you know, I mean, holder, you know, I mean, kids who are like, you know, I mean, secular, who want to emulate, you know, I mean, the West in their lifestyle, who listen to, you know, rock and, you know, I mean, and music and blah, blah, blah. And so this whole picture can get tainted if people realize the reality that first, it wasn't a peaceful revolution. It included storming and burning down police stations. Secondly, I mean, the urban poor, you know, those barefooted, you know, kids in the streets, you know, they played the major role in confrontations with the police forces and the forces of the state in the streets. Thirdly, that the revolution happened because it was the climax of a movement of mass strikes in the previous years conducted by the working classes in the region and specifically in Egypt, whereby they were not just calling for bread and butter issues, but they were calling for eliminating corruption from the ranks of the management. Corruption here means or reads, you know, people who are affiliated with the ruling regime, and they were calling for independent trade unions. Now, as soon as Mubarak was forced to step down, both the military, in addition to large sections of the revolutionaries who came from the middle class backgrounds, they vented their anger on the workers who continued striking. And they were calling on the workers to stop strikes and devote their attention to the political process. Now let's talk about the constitution. Let's talk about the parliament. Let's talk about forming a government, and then this government is going to give you your rights. But don't keep on striking at the moment. Even one of the most famous liberal icons of the Egyptian political arena, you know, Amr Hamzawi, who is also who's quite well known in the academic circles here in Germany. One of his first initiatives after the uprising was calling for the formation of groups of revolutionary youth that will be sent out to the factories in order to convince the workers to suspend their strikes, because it's not time for strikes. This is greedy, you know, I mean, demands. So that's why they are not really big on the social side, you know, I mean, the narratives that deal with the Arab Spring, because then it conflicts with the interests of so many people who are running the show, more or less.
I want to talk a little bit more about Egypt, but briefly. I mean, since the overthrowing of the Muslim Brotherhood President Mohamed Morsi, we saw promises from Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to make sure that Egypt would remain secular, speaking of his government. So what are your thoughts on that?
This is a big joke, and this is the same card that was also played by Mubarak, you know, for 3 decades, that of trying to paint themselves as like the secular enlightened government that's like fighting those, Islamists with beards, and that we are like your last barrier of defense against those medieval types of guys, who are all like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and blah, blah, blah. But this is a joke. Number one, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is very religious, by the way. And he makes no, and he doesn't really try to hide it in any sense. The Egyptian regime is very conservative. Our security services and our police force and the military are very conservative. And already we've been seeing, following the coup, the biggest crackdowns on the gay community in Egypt, for example, or the LGBTQ community in Egypt, they happened following the coup. The coup that supposedly, was about saving Egypt from the Islamists and from turning into Afghanistan. Oh my God, this was like, the rallying cry for everyone. So we had the biggest crackdowns in our history against the LGBTQ community. The Egyptian regime is going after what we call like, Fatayat TikTok, the TikTok women. TikTok is an app, and probably most, if not all your viewers, are familiar with it, if not using it already. It's very popular among teenagers, and it was popular among teenagers in Egypt. And many women influencers who were secular, or like they were not veiled, they were beautiful or good looking or trying to be good looking, and they were using TikTok, to basically create for themselves either a following or like to use it for marketing. The government has been rounding them up in mass, in big numbers, and accusing them of, it's a very weird accusation, threatening the Egyptian family values. That's like a new accusation now that's being labeled. And when it comes to treating the bodies of women, and when it comes to any issues related to gender, the regime is more horrible than the Islamists, actually. So it's not secular in any sense. And by the way, even the legislation and the institutions, the religion is enshrined in it. I am not against, the religion. If the people want, a form of rule or the other, people have the right to choose whatever they want. But don't try to fool the world by trying to portray yourself as secular, while religion is one of the main pillars that you are trying to prop up to give yourself legitimacy.
Yeah.
So we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you one last question. Obviously, or rather, the counter-revolution has different faces in different countries. In Egypt, it was Sisi. In Syria, it's Assad. In the United States, maybe you could argue it was Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was criticized in foreign policy for apparently or seemingly cozying up to authoritarians and dictators like Sisi. There's that famous image of him and Sisi and somebody from Saudi Arabia all with their hands on that glowing orb.
And they complimented Sisi for his shoes, yeah, like on air.
Rich people tend to have nice shoes, they may have been good. And it seemed like for a few years there at least, the United States was lining up with the counter-revolutionary states in the Arab world, and then we kind of had a new authoritarian international. Now, regardless of whether one thinks that that rhetoric was a bit overblown or not, Trump is now lost, and there's not going to be a coup. He's not going to somehow withhold power after January 20th, although don't tell the liberals. Do you think that having a Joe Biden administration in the United States will have any effect on the Arab world? Do the Arab people care who the president of the United States is? And will it have any effect on the way that states in the Arab world deal with their populations?
My short answer is yes. I mean, make no mistake. I mean, Joe Biden is someone who is from the American establishment. He is someone who previously, during the uprising in Egypt, refused to label Mubarak as a dictator, citing that he's a friend of the United States and he's a friend of Israel. And, you know, he's not like some Nelson Mandela. Like, you know, I'm not really like, you know, I mean, or some Che Guevara, you know, who's now in the White House. Surprise, surprise. So I don't have any illusions about like some radical change that he's gonna bring. But at the same time, I expect that yes, there will be slight change. There is a difference between someone who is publicly supporting fascism, publicly supporting every single bad, evil cause on the planet, like, you know, I mean, on the record, and normalizing it, you know, and patting all the dictators on their shoulders. There is a difference between that and between someone who is part of the establishment at the end of the day, but at the same time, he will have to respond to a base and to some pressures from his base that elected him, so as to make a little bit of accountability for, you know, I mean, those allies who are proxies, basically, for the US. And that would include Sisi. I'm not expecting that, you know, that he will phone up Sisi and ask him, like, you know, to release the 60,000 political prisoners, or to do the same with Saudi Arabia and the others. But what I expect that there will be some pressure on the Arab regimes to release some of the high-profile political dissidents who are known in the West and who are secular, to be frank. The kind of guys that, you know, that Amnesty can campaign for, you know, and you can find their posters, you know, I mean, here in Germany. I'm not trying to dismiss them. I'm not trying to mock them. I mean, I am for the release of all political prisoners from all shades, whether secular or Islamists. And I don't and I don't compare anyone's plight, and I think, or say that someone is like much more eligible for release than the other, and for all of them to be released. But you asked me like my opinion as an analyst and what I expect. And what I expect to happen is that there might be some releases of human rights defenders, of bloggers, of some lawyers, some like, you know, left-wing or like liberal dissidents. But as for the rest of basically the tyrannical structures that we have, I don't think there will be fundamental change.
Okay. Well, on that fairly sober note is where we're going to have to leave it. I want to thank Hossam for taking the hour to speak with us today. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, this is going to be our last episode for a while. We're going on a hiatus throughout the spring as we reconceptualize how to continue with the series in the future. I want to thank everyone who watched. I'd like to thank Fida for joining me for the last 8 months. And everyone watching at home, a safe and happy pandemic Christmas season, and we'll see you in the new year. Thanks a lot.